I would like to welcome you on behalf of LSE Cities to this evening event on Mobilities of Care with a focus on transport, cities and gender. And talking about languages, I immediately want to highlight this is a hybrid event. So we will have participants, of course, in this very room, but also dialing in from across the world. And that allows us to also offer translation. So there will be Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic as needed. My name is Philip Rode. I'm the Exec Director of LSE Cities, the research center here at the LSE that has the pleasure of hosting this evening event, and also the center that is hosting the Urban95 Academy on behalf of the LSE. And that is a leadership program to help urban leaders to design better cities for young children and their caregivers. And with our wonderful director of the program, Savas Verdis, we have brought together more than 180 cities over the last 18 months. So that is a significant number. And we're absolutely thrilled that this week, this event coincides with bringing together the latest of our cohorts, cohort 4, and a very warm welcome to them as well. I want to highlight that the Urban95 Academy is very much co-produced and co-organized with the Bernhard von Leer Foundation, and we are enormously grateful for their support. And it's been a wonderful journey, and we very much hope to further institutionalize this very setup and arrangement and the Academy. So it's just the beginning of an important journey. Now, tonight we are here to hear about a new toolkit that addresses the theme of the night. It's called BYCS, and it refers to enabling particularly women and other caregivers to embrace cycling as part of daily mobility needs. We will hear about why and how policymakers and practitioners can support bike uptake for care journeys. That's a very novel and interesting theme. I'll say more about this in a second. But we are also here to recognize that there's a very strong gender dimension about this issue. And it is mostly mothers and women who care for children that are conducting these kind of trips, and that will be very much recognized throughout the evening. Now, we also want to reflect on several broader themes, which then come to the fore. And first of all, very much from the beginning, appreciate how much little knowledge there is about this notion of mobilities of care, something that in a moment with Alex's help, we're also going to define a bit more. What do we actually mean when we're talking about this? We also, of course, want to come back to the broader critical gender lens, appreciate how much transport planning has been locked into a practice that is in many ways deeply problematic if we are coming from an inclusive gender perspective. We are trying to emphasize in our discussion that there's a far greater need to engage with caregivers and far beyond physical infrastructures, appreciate that there are many barriers to bike uptake for care functions that are not just spatial, they are behavioral and they are social and cultural. So I hope we can talk about that as well. And we do want to learn from city governments in the best tradition of LSE Cities. What is the practice on the ground? What is happening already? What can be done on top? There are 3 cities which we'll come back to throughout the evening: Mexico City, Istanbul, and Bengaluru. Now, before introducing tonight's speakers, allow me a personal observation. I studied transport systems and planning in the 1990s in Berlin, in Germany. And at that point, I was actually taught by very few women, and I had very few classmates that were women. We also had many of our sessions taught by professors that actually very openly suggested that walking and cycling isn't real transport. And on top of that, I started my research career focusing on non-work related travel, and I couldn't believe how little evidence we had on those kind of trips, which are actually the biggest majority of the travel we see in our cities. It's one of the big quiz questions. I won't do that with you tonight, but it's absolutely astonishing that for the only 20% of trips that take place in our cities work-related, we're essentially designing most of the transport planning around the 20%, ignoring not only care trips, but a whole range of other trips which happen in our cities. Now, these three observations are, of course, linked. They are connected. And we have come a long way to really recognizing the gender implications of conventional transport thinking and practice. So that's great news. And today, we're not only able to connect it to the broader gender question, but we are recognizing that by not having appreciated that enough, it relates also to the bigger social and environmental challenges our cities are facing. So the proxy of dealing with a gender perspective in transport is also an enabling perspective towards greener and more inclusive accessibility. Let me now introduce our panel. We have a presentation in a moment, first by Alex Baum, who is Programs and Systems Manager at BYCS. And BYCS is, on the one hand, the title of our report we are referring to, but it's also an institution. It's an Amsterdam-based global NGO supporting community-led urban action through cycling. And Alex's specific focus is on connecting global change makers and amplifying their work through these connections. We will then have two respondents. Camila Herrero is a policy and cycling inclusion manager at BYCS, and she's a cyclist advocate and urbanist who studied international relations and urban geography. She worked before at international organizations such as ITTP Mexico and Bike and City, as well as with regional and local governments in Latin America. And our second respondent will be Tiffany Lam, a graduate from the LSE. Wonderful to have you back here. She's an expert on inclusive active travel, has worked with cities and organizations in the UK, the US, and in Europe and Latin America to promote cycling equity. Currently, she is a strategy lead at a UK organization called Sustrans and responsible there for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we have a wonderful group to hear from, to debate and discuss. The structure for tonight, we have about 80 minutes left. We'll take the session in 3 blocks. First, there will be the presentation by Alex for about 20 minutes, followed by 5-minute respondents by Camilla and Tiffany. Second, we'll have a 30-minute panel discussion amongst ourselves. And then, of course, we'll open it up to you in the room and also to our online audience. You may already throughout want to keep typing your questions and comments, and we will record them and take care of them. So for now, please join me in welcoming Alex for his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you to those joining online. Great to have you here. I was told the camera's there, so I'm going to look at you whenever I talk to all of you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk, this is a broad topic, I guess you could say, that we're discussing here tonight, and I'm going to talk about an aspect of that. Thank you so much. So supporting cycling uptake for care journeys. And what I'd like to do this evening, just give a brief introduction about bikes that Philip mentioned, talk a little bit about this topic, give a little background. I think some people in the room have a good sense of what I'm talking about, but others, this might be quite new and there might be some confusing terminology. So I'd like to talk about that and then finally come back to the work we've done at BYCS on this topic and celebrate actually with you all tonight the launch of the toolkit that Philip mentioned, which we're very excited about. So just a little bit about BYCS. Philip mentioned the sort of the headline of our organization, this idea of bicycles transform cities and cities transform the world. So this linkage between a mode of transport amongst other things, and the way we organize our societies and the important connection between the two for so many different things. And as he also mentioned, this connection between these community-led cycling initiatives and the ability we have at Bikes to nurture, strengthen, and scale these globally through this focus on human infrastructure, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. But really, the emphasis on Bikes is not to be knowledge colonialists. We're not going into communities saying this is how you have to do it. We're really sort of picking from global examples and saying, what can we learn from this, and what can we share, and what can we amplify to grow the greater impact to cities across the world. The four major pillars of our work is this global network. Some of you may have heard of the Bicycle Mayor Network, a network of 140 volunteers throughout the globe representing cities, so connecting the work that's happening in their city to other cities, but also really trying to unify the work in their city. Research and thought leadership, of course, some of which I'll mention here tonight. Engagement programs, really on-the-ground programs that we can test in certain contexts and then scale to others, and then advising governments on how they can embrace and implement and prioritize these topics for the betterment of their cities. So that's just a little bit about Bikes. I will come back to Bikes and talk a little bit more about our work on this topic, but I just want to sort of take a step back on this topic just to make sure there's hopefully no confusion on it. So when we talk about mobility of care, we are talking about any sort of transport, trips, mobility that result from this idea of caring for someone else. And this can be, in the case of a child, this can be taking a child to childcare. This can include grocery shopping, trips to medical appointments. There are so many different types of trips that fall under this broad umbrella of mobilities of care. And what you can see on the diagram on the right side is sort of the difference between the two. And as Philip was alluding to, kind of how transport planning has been traditionally done with this concept of home, work, home. And then you see the much more complex diagram on the bottom of a caregiver, and how there are many smaller trips, often shorter distances, but linked. So it's not just 1 to 1, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 back to 1. And we'll talk about how the bicycle represents an amazing opportunity for this type of travel. And what I'll come back to and what I'll say, and Philip also alluded to this, is how this concept is really misunderstood, underrepresented, undercounted, and yet it represents such a proportionally large number of trips, large number of members of a city population, and thus such a missed opportunity, or you could say a potential opportunity to really influence how people move through cities. So just to give a bit of clarification on this word caregiver, which I've been told does not translate well in other languages, so I'm curious how the translators are translating it. I think it's much longer than the word caregiver. But so this is someone who looks after so in this case, we're talking about focusing on children. There is, of course, care for elderly. There are different types of care, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about children. This can be done sort of on a temporary basis, I think it's traditionally associated with parents, but this could include grandparents or those who do this for paid work, but often this work is unpaid. This is generally associated with a gender neutral, is not associated, but research has shown that caregiving work is done 70% of the time by women and girls. So often, and I'll talk a little bit later about that, we do, our work focuses on women caregivers. So now to bring it back to, or to bring it to cycling, when we talk about caregiving, different studies say somewhere between 28 and 40% of trips are a result of this mobility of care. And when you really stop and think about that, and think that that is not taken into account when cities are planning their mobility, it is shocking. 28 to 40% of trips are not even counted. How is that possible? Can you imagine in any other context leaving out that much of volume and not thinking anything of it. That's crazy to me. And so that's why this is so important. This is not a niche topic. This is a major portion that is not taken into account. And of course, this profoundly affects this sort of, when we talk about cycling, the gender gap in cycling, the need of, again, I talked about how 70% of care trips are done by women. If that is their responsibility and there is not the ability or the infrastructure for them to do that by bicycle, we then can see obviously a major reason why there is such a gender gap. And again, we'll talk about this more in the panel later on. Cycling offers a number of benefits. If you think of that diagram with the 1, 2, 3, 4 back to 1, and you think about taking a bus or a train to try to do those in comparison to a bicycle, there are a number of benefits. But again, there is a major knowledge gap on this. This is not understood, it's not counted, and that represents a major issue. So talking about some of the benefits, I talk about cycling every day, but I realize most people don't. So I have to ground this discussion and just remind that, yeah, there are a number of benefits specifically for caregivers when it comes to, those linked trips, being able to make quick stops on a bicycle. Again, assuming there is a safe way of doing it. The ability to do that more energy efficient, being able to cover longer distances in comparison to walking, and in some cases, public transit. The reliability of having a bicycle that you can sort of take from place to place and the flexibility that it provides, the relative low cost of it compared to a number of different other modes, the connection, especially when caregivers are cycling with a child, the connection they have with that child, whether it's sitting in front or even behind them. A lot of research has been done on the importance of, conversing as caregivers are cycling with their child, or even just a touch of the hand on the back of the child, that reinforcement of attachment. The connection that provides to the community, and the physical and mental health benefits that cycling provides, but specifically for caregivers, again, having multiple responsibilities and the flexibility that it provides. But of course, there are a number of barriers. I think often in conversations around bicycle lanes, what we forget is this other component, the human infrastructure of cycling, the skills, the awareness, the self-efficacy required, the access to bicycles that is needed. And specifically for caregivers, when we talk about access to bicycles and equipment, just an anecdote, a caregiver in Latin America in an interview told me that she felt so intimidated walking into a bicycle shop staffed entirely by men. It's something we don't think about, or some of us don't think about, but that is a major barrier right there. The fact that the proper equipment for transporting children or groceries is not sold in most countries, or even the proper bicycles. Of course, a number of other barriers relating to the socioeconomic perspective, that the cultural perspective that cycling is only for either the very wealthy or the very poor, and that a mother cycling with a child is actually putting her child at risk by cycling. And of course, concerns around gender violence for caregivers while cycling, sort of being so exposed on the road. And of course, traffic safety, insufficient infrastructure in most countries. Just to give a sense of who is working on this topic, this is not exhaustive. These are just some examples from our research. A few academics, Leah Ravensbergen, I think would be probably the most well-known on this topic, but I'm sure you all can name others. Some institutions, sort of advocacy and non-governmental institutions, hello. The IADB, ITDP, bikes, of course. One of the cities I just think is important to call out is Bogota and the work that they've done. And then just some industry groups, Rambo, safety pin. But again, there are others, just to give a sense that it is a multi-sector thing. It's not that no one is working on it, but it is still a very nascent, very niche subject. So to bring it back to bikes and the work that we've done on cycling mobilities of care and why this is part of the mission that I described at the beginning of the topic. Again, such a large number. If you think of the fact that in many developing countries, children make up a third of the population of cities, and then you account for all the people who are looking after those children, you're talking about such a large group that are not taken into account when we talk about mobility. The transferability of the concepts that we're talking about here. If a city is planned for children and caregivers, often it's taking into account the barriers that exist for other groups. So if you plan a city around children, I think you could say you are in theory taking into account the barriers of the rest of the population versus the other way around, which is generally how cities are planned for the most able. This is sort of turning that on its head. The opportunity here, again, when we talk about how this group is undercounted and underrepresented in transport planning to really increase cycling in cities. I mentioned the networks we have at Bikes and the opportunity to connect so many of these disparate efforts through our networks and really try to elevate and amplify and connect that work. And then also capacitate. There are a lot of governments sitting in the room here today. Capacitate all of you to be able to take these groups into account in your planning when it comes to cycling. So just a little bit of background on the work. It's a relatively recent topic within our organization, but starting with researching what are some of those benefits and barriers, and then saying, okay, well, we need to put this knowledge into practice, and what are some of the cities that we could do? So starting in 2020 and then in 2021, really scoping out of a group of 12 cities around the world, where was best suited to test out this work and see what works, what doesn't. So in this past year, putting that into practice in the 3 cities that Philip mentioned, Mexico City, Istanbul, and Bengaluru. And that generation of the knowledge products, which I'll talk about here tonight. So just to sort of connect back to this concept of human infrastructure as opposed to built infrastructure. So built infrastructure is sort of the bike lanes, the physical things you can touch that allow someone to cycle. Human infrastructure is everything else that can either be a barrier or an opportunity to someone cycling. That's the awareness that it is an opportunity. That's the skills one needs to be able to cycle. That is the access to a safe, secure access to bicycles and bike parking, and the stimulation to actually be able to do it. This concept, I think, is very misunderstood when we say build it and they will come. Build a bike lane and people will cycle. I think that's partially right, but I think that's really misunderstanding. And so with this initiative, we've really tried to, and all of our work, focus on this concept of human infrastructure of cycling and really addressing specific barriers. And I mentioned earlier the focus on women caregivers as a result of the proportion of care trips done by women. So the projects we've done have focused primarily on women caregivers, but of course, men play a role in caregiving as well. And the resulting higher burden of transport poverty as a result of having to take on that caregiving that women face, and also really starting to address the gender gap in cycling, as well as the influence women can have within the family. If a woman is able to cycle and her children are able to cycle, and then the rest of the family is able to cycle, you're able to have this real ripple effect once you can have the caregiver cycling. Talk about some of the consortium that worked on this project. Again, huge thank you to Brennan van Leer Foundation for supporting this work and supporting us being here this evening, and all the work we've done on this topic, but also BYCS in Mexico City, Chain Breaking Women in Istanbul, and Purpose in Bengaluru. So the last 3 obviously were the implementation partners on the ground and enabled us to gather those learnings and inform the knowledge products I'll talk about here tonight. Just an example from Mexico City, the Bicicatarinas. They focused on 2 low-income neighborhoods in the north of Mexico City and offered 2 mothers and women caregivers workshops on learning to cycle, really kind of building those skills, that human infrastructure, using a set of bicycles that were basically thrown away by a bike share system when the business decided to get out of bike share. And they repurposed those bicycles so that these women could use them. They did group rides, really starting to build that sense of community and togetherness and confidence. And then really trying to understand what is the power of this work with focus groups and community building, really encouraging each other to get out and cycle for their daily trips and understanding the impact of that on them. Some of the results of the project of the pilot, in this case in Mexico City, cost savings. I don't think anything that was, maybe with the exception of the last one, was expected. They did not realize the cost savings the women would benefit from as a result of having the bicycles, the weight loss from the physical activity as a result of cycling, and this sense of freedom and decreased isolation. I think especially newer caregivers who just, in the case of a mother who's just had a child, often talking about this feeling of isolation and disconnectedness, and the bicycle being able to create more of a connection, and also happiness and community belonging. So from the work we did, we created a insights report, and here are the recommendations from it. So really talking, so directed at cities generally, but really the 5 recommendations are thinking about in the research, better understanding how gender plays a role in mobility is the first one. Engaging with caregivers as caregivers when you're trying to understand this topic within your city. Of course, prioritizing, not of course, but prioritizing this concept of cycling mobilities of care in your planning, your capacity building, and your communication. And then sort of the other side is the human infrastructure. So it's the programs that increase the skills, the self-efficacy. And then finally, the access to the equipment to make it possible for people to utilize cycling for these types of trips. If you want, here is the QR code for the report. It'll take you to the program page where you can access. I believe we also have one printed copy for each of the cities that are part of the Urban95 Academy. So we'll make sure to get that to you as well. I can also put this up later in case you don't get it now, but I'll give you an extra second. There, hope you got it. So, talking about the report and the insights and the recommendations, and then shifting, as Philip mentioned, to the idea of a toolkit. So, okay, we're bought in, we want to do this, we want this in our city. How do we do it? And so tonight we are launching this, this toolkit, really thinking about how government, civil society, and individuals could launch a program like the ones we did in the 3 cities I mentioned to really help provide caregivers with the skills, experience, and confidence necessary to start cycling or to cycle more frequently, especially for care trips. And to really take advantage of the many benefits that that provides. And what we see is government really being able to have the opportunity to step up and prioritize and support these kind of programs, and for non-governmental organizations and grassroots organizations to actually provide the connection to some of the most vulnerable populations within cities. Just to give a sense of how the tool, this may be very small for you, but just as a visual sense, the toolkit is broken down into 4 phases. Basically how you would set up the initial steps, how you would sort of get a sense of what you're actually going to focus on, what are your goals, who you're going to work with, some of the very specific steps that are needed before you undertake such a thing. And then in phase 2, really sort of preparing your program, making sure that you Yeah, all the logistics from bicycles to location to things like that. It really guides you through how to do that. Phase 3 is the sort of implementation, and that provides the user of the toolkit with sort of a checklist. What are things to take into account, things that we learn from these initiatives, these pilot initiatives. And then 4 is sort of looking back on your initiative. What went well, what didn't go well, how can we scale it? Just to show an example of a page from the toolkit and give you a sense of how it's organized, what you can see on the top gives a sense of what phase you're in. The iconography in the upper left, the phases are broken down into different focus areas. In this case, the direction with the arrow icon indicates over the course of the phases, the different sort of sub-focuses. The tools themselves are referred to with the little gear in the gray box there. And then in the yellow box on the right is various examples from the 3 cities that participated in the project to give a sense of context and how something like this was actually implemented. Again, I know this is very small, but just 2 examples of some of the tools in the toolkit part. On the left, you can see this bicycle checklist. So when deciding which kind of bicycles to use, things to consider. And then on the right, partner mapping, when you're thinking of putting together a program like this, who to think about, who has priority when it comes to planning such a program. And then finally, yes, I would like to take this moment, this is my last slide, to officially celebrate, and thank you all for being here to celebrate with us the launch of this toolkit. Again, it's available on our website, and we are very excited about it. We hope you all are able to use it in some way, or at least distribute it to those who can. And once again, thank you so much for being here.
So Alex, we're clapping for you, but we're also clapping for the launch of the toolkit.
Yes, absolutely.
Double moment. So let's immediately continue with our respondents, and I'll ask Camilla first. 5 minutes.
Right. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, I'm also very happy to be launching this. I've been working with different local governments and different organizations around the world. And this is the first time that I see a product that can help actually communities to implement projects and programs related to cycling mobilities of care. But one thing that I would like to highlight is that, yes, we are talking about women who are cycling and who are taking care of others, but what we are really talking about, or what I think we should be talking about, is about caring cities and how cities can really provide everyone with what we need. And we often, and well, Alex mentioned, we're talking about women who have children, but we are really talking about women. So most of the caring activities are carried by women. And in order for women to take care of others, they need to take care of themselves. So here, what we also need to talk about is how are we providing women with all of the infrastructure, but beyond the infrastructure, all of the necessary things, the services, so that women can take care of themselves and therefore can take care of others. And therefore, everyone else can take care of themselves, right? Because we often say that if we design and we think about cities for children, for women, for elderly, for vulnerable groups, we are taking care of everyone. So, well, my first moment is just an invitation to maybe talk about what is a caring city and how can we provide this for everyone. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Tiffany.
That was a really interesting presentation, and the toolkit looks really useful. 3 points from me. The first one is around human infrastructure and how essential but underlooked that is in active travel policy and planning. and the Oakland Bike Plan, which Oakland, California released in 2019 or so, is the first cycling policy document that explicitly states that investment in cycling infrastructure means both physical and social infrastructure for cycling. So that's all the behavior change programs needed, outreach and education. So it's really good to see that enshrined in a cycling policy document. The second point I want to make was I was really glad to see Bogota mentioned, and I was in Bogota in 2019 to support the implementation of the 50-50 More Women on Bicycles initiative, which was the first ever policy initiative to try and achieve gender parity in cycling. And one of the early realizations was that in order to achieve 50-50 women and men on bikes in the city, you really need to focus on caring journeys. And the definition of care that they used was very expansive. So there was a focus on children and people who care for children, but they're also looking at caring for older people, sick people, and health and social care workers and their journeys, including to and from work and other journeys they made in the course of their days. And the final point for now is what I'd really like to see is the integration of the concept of the mobility of care with parallel dialogues going on around a green and caring economy or a care-led recovery from COVID. I think there needs to be more integration of economic and transport analysis when it comes to gender, care, and how we plan around caring responsibilities.
Thank you very much. And it's helpful to have this very concise and brief for both sort of the statements being made approach, because we have now a bit more time to discuss this as a panel here. We have, in some ways for tonight, 3 different entry points. Maybe for sort of the broader conversation, most conventional one is about cycling and the extended question about how do you get more people on bikes. Maybe this is something we can come back to, but it seems to me that it could be less of a priority for now, just thinking of the novelty or novelties of subjects which have been put forward by Alex and the team. The second big category is around gender and transport, which brings us a bit closer to sort of the more sort of detailed observations and agendas, which I think we probably want to talk a bit more about. But I guess the biggest opportunity to start this conversation is around the notion of caring mobilities, where, you know, I said I wanted to shock the audience with a statistic how little the percentage of trips or even kilometers traveled work-related are in our cities. You shocked us even more with your stat that, you know, it may be even 40% care-related. It's almost impossible to appreciate that this has not been an agenda to a far greater extent. I mean, sometimes in my transport world, I enter fora where the discussion is now, oh, we always talk about the mobility of people and we need to talk about goods movement. And, you know, everyone recognizes their blind spots. But it seems to me you have sort of put your finger at the uber blind spot in transport. Massive, massive. And I'm just curious to understand, I mean, can we explain it only because, or is it primarily because it's so gendered that it hasn't received the attention? Or are there other reasons besides sort of a gender bias why this issue of transport, and usually what you would probably argue in transport is the degree to which trips are necessary, the degree to which they are economically contributing to wealth generation. I mean, these are sort of the more conventional points. But I'm curious to understand, besides explaining it that it's a bunch of white men that don't care about women, obvious explanation, what are other reasons that this is not more centrally on our planning agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe just a theory. I think thinking about how we, how we move through the city and who is moving through the city based on their sort of somewhat their role within society. And I'm not going to say that caregivers, that's their only role, but that is a role they play in society, I think is a lens that is not often thought about within mobility. We often talk about, you know, we talk about, I think, trips based on purpose, you know, sort of going to work. But when it comes to care, I think it's the connection to the role, I think is been really missed. And I think that is a key point. Just one theory, but I'd love to hear from the other two.
And a quick follow-up, how much do you think our mobilities of care is essentially about chauffeuring versus accessing sites of care, even without having to maybe move a person that needs to be cared of?
Well, yeah, and that's why I think this concept is quite misunderstood, is that it's not just taking a child to childcare, even any sort of trips that result from sort of the household maintenance, which is part of caring, grocery, any sort of shopping that is needed for the household. These, you know, I think trips were sort of thought of as separate from that, or just not having such a significant purpose when it comes to the functioning of the household. But really, it is quite a broad group.
And still, it seems that what these trips share is that they often require you to transport more than yourself.
Exactly.
I mean, as the caregiver, you are this traveling service, fine, but in many instances, you will have to bring the subject of your care with you, or even tools and equipment. So that is a very important point. Tiffany, what would you, I mean, you have been in the space, maybe more on the gender and on the cycling advocacy end. And here we are now supercharging your agenda with the care reference and care mobilities. Is it helpful? Is it making your work even more complex? How do you react to an input, the wonderful yellow booklet?
I think it's a very useful toolkit and will help make this agenda more mainstream. And I think overall care is very devalued. We do have a crisis of care in the UK and many other countries, and our transport systems have been in the service of economic growth, and the economic system currently undervalues care, and care is considered unproductive. And I think by making the mobility of care a more prominent agenda on transport, or for transport policy and planning, as well as economic policy, then we have a real big opportunity to transform our economies and transform our cities.
Thank you. And Camilla, if we now move from, you already, Tiffany, you mentioned the UK is already problematic, the way we think about caregivers. If we go to a country like yours, Mexico, where you are not only having a sort of general inequalities of who gives care and who pays for care, but these are sort of superimposed on top of deep inequalities, and the people that are taking care of children are often, part of a hierarchy of how society is perceived, where the complexities Alex talked about are becoming even more difficult. How does the concept, how does this whole idea, we have seen photos, of course, from Global South context, but how does it translate? You know, the way we would talk about these mobilities in London or in Amsterdam surely must be very different compared to moving to a context like Mexico City.
Yeah, but I would like to go back a little bit to the first question, because I think it's relevant. So I don't necessarily think that these trips are not counted, but that they are invisibilized, right? Because they are normally accounted with other names. So it's not that they are not counted. So the trips are there, and they are in the numbers and all of the econometrics or whatsoever, whatever, but they are invisibilized. So, and I think it has to do with your question, because we are still talking about this separation of the productive city and the reproductive city, right? So especially in regions like Latin America and Mexico. The cities really happen because of all of the reproductive labor that is invisibilized, right? And most of these reproductive labor happens in all of the informal settlements and in the outskirts of the city, but those parts of the city are not seen, are completely invisibilized by politicians, by policymakers, and by everyone, really. So I think, yeah, it's more acid, right? The reality of this concept in Mexico, in Latin America, because it's way more unseen. So I think that's it.
Thank you. Let's move on a bit to this idea of where do we start with the broader transformation towards embracing the bicycle as the preferred choice for this kind of travel. I think if you would ask people in the street, they would probably argue, well, the first thing you want is sort of people to confidently and comfortably cycle by themselves, probably adults, initially men, maybe. I mean, this is how it seems to happen in many countries where cycling is sort of, again, being rediscovered. Then you start mainstreaming it. And in some ways, you could make the argument that the mobilities of care comes at the tail end of a long process of cultural change, of accepting cycling is actually something that is safe and healthy and acceptable and so on. Are you jumping the ship by sort of maybe even starting with the most complicated part? Alex?
Potentially, but I think if we are going to reach the levels of cycling that we need in order to make our cities more sustainable and livable and all the benefits that cycling provides, we do need to make that jump. We don't have time to go through this very sort of slow and gradual process of, well, we'll have a bike lane on this street and then next year we'll have one on that street. We really need transformational change in our cities. And that's why we see the potential of, again, such a large group of people, so many trips. If we can design cities for this group, we can, and I'm not saying it's easy. I'm definitely not saying it's easy, but it's what we need to do. And I think if we start with this perspective, we avoid, I would argue, many of the mistakes made in previous versions. If we start from thinking about the perspective of caregivers and young children, then, as I said, we're really sort of already addressing many of the needs and barriers of other groups. So yeah, it is a challenge, but I'm putting it out to cities to accept the challenge.
And Tiffany, your work having really sort of been at the forefront of getting mainstreaming cycling, have a much more inclusive buy-in to cycling activities. If you had to sort of judge what comes first, is it cycling without kids? Is it cycling as a kid or cycling with kids? Have you had experiences where you can see the benefit actually of jumping the queue and starting maybe with the most difficult one?
I think it makes a lot of sense to start with Mobilities of Care, because when you think about the journeys that women are more likely to make, they're more likely to be short journeys within 5 miles or so, within a relatively small area. So women are more likely to do more frequent but shorter distance trips throughout the day. And these trips are very bikeable. And in terms of time savings, it would just be faster to cycle than to walk. So I think there's a very clear and logical argument for starting with the mobility of care.
And Tiffany, what responsibilities do active cyclists at the present have to maybe make it more inclusive? Are there behaviors within the cycling community that are actually sort of exclusionary, that differentiate us and them and so on?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we can do to promote cycling is just to normalize it and make it seen as an easy and everyday thing that anyone can do. So I for example, don't cycle with a helmet or lycra. And I think it's just really important to remove all these barriers. And there's a lot of evidence showing that one of the biggest barriers to cycling is the perception that it's not for someone like me. Or I think even in London, close to 50% of Londoners don't think cycling's for people like me. And so we need to diversify the imagery we use to represent people cycling. And we also need to bear in mind what we look like in the practices we embody when we're cycling, and try and ensure that it's helping to remove that barrier that people like me don't cycle.
And what do we know, just maybe bringing it closer to the gender issue, where I think there are interesting studies that look at how teenage boys and girls relate to cycling, and that at a certain age really diverges, where the bike becomes almost an embarrassment if you're not really into it from a sporty perspective, or from, you're sort of culturally dedicated to hipster cycling. What's happening there? I mean, and social media seems to play a key role here. Have you observed patterns of positioning the bicycle as an object of desire for, fairly at a certain period of age, vulnerable groups, teenagers that are seeking for identities, and when they reject it, they have to maybe recover over a period of 10 years to go back to it. And then they're already mothers, and maybe they're still sort of not really accepting it as from almost a cultural perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a bigger drop-off rate for cycling among teenage girls than teenage boys. And I think a small part of it is around the bicycle as a desirable thing to have and be on. But I think a bigger issue is sexual harassment in public space, which I think close to 90% of women in the UK, women and girls, have experienced public sexual harassment, especially on public transport. And nearly 2/3 have changed their behaviors as a result. And this includes stopping to cycle, or stopping to go out at certain times of day, or stopping going to certain areas. So I think the bigger problem is just gender-based violence and how that's really normalized in everyday life.
Thank you very much. And then a final question, Camilla. I mean, you said you want to really link the concept to the caring city and the much broader caring framework. Say a bit more about it, because again, I think caring mobilities in the sort of broader framework of ethics of care hasn't yet featured that much. It's still very niche. If it's such a prominent component, why is that not better reflected? Well, what is your answer?
I don't know why it's not there, but I think it has to do with what Tiffany just said, which is how, and what I said in the beginning, which is how women, we take care of ourselves, no? And if we need to take care of ourselves, and there is this street that we pass every day and we know there is violence, we are gonna avoid it, right? And how this impact really the caring activities that we need to take. So if we need to go shopping to the end of that street, but we cannot cross that street, we need to avoid it, right? So I think it really has to do with the embodiment, with the experience of movement in the city. I really like the diagram of the mobility patterns between men and women, and I like to see that diagram because it's very explicit. It really shows you the trip chaining of women and the pendular trips of men, but I kind of have a conflict with it because I think it goes back again to the mobility patterns. So going from A to B, and it doesn't really explain or show this embodiment of the experience of moving in the city. And yeah, well, as most women know, like we really live our body in the city more than men do. So I think caring for ourselves means to really go back to the experience of moving more than thinking of like, yeah, transport, right? Like before, from an engineering lens, going from A to B. But also going to more structural needs of women, which is basically a lot of women don't even know how to cycle, right? Or there are a lot of cultures in which cycling is not perceived, it's not accepted. It's still a male practice. So I think caring for in relation to women has to do with all of this complexity.
Thank you very much. I could go on and on and on, but we have 30 minutes left, and we want to make sure that you, our wonderful audience, get the opportunity to ask questions as well. So the way we're going to do this, I'm just looking at Katie, whether we have already online. We want to take 3 questions in one go. Ideally, we want to know who is asking the questions, if these are colleagues which have already submitted this online, and which city they are from. The briefer the question, the better. So Katie, if we can just maybe choose 3 from our Zoom participants.
Definitely. So we actually have about over 150 people who've joined us from all over the world online. We have many questions, but I'll try to pick a few. So we have a question from Fiorella, who is a student at the University of Colorado, Denver. And her question is, what is your advice to start a program for biking when there's no government support? So she wants to know, how do we address this problem to the mayor and to get their attention?
Okay, great. Let's go to the second question.
Okay. We have another question from Thais in Fortaleza, Brazil, and she's actually an alumni of the Urban95 Academy, so wonderful to hear her on here. And she says they've achieved a lot actually in her city expanding cycling infrastructure. But what she wants to ask you is, what would be the first step to consider that you would consider the most important in terms of good practice a city could do to achieve a woman and caregiver as potential users?
Thank you. And one last one.
Choose one more question. I think actually one of your the bicycle mayor in Tehran, Mohammed Nazapour, has a question from Iran. He's saying, in his context, there are many barriers to women cycling, and his friends, he says, thinks that it's too early to think about women and caregivers and to promote this idea in his city. But what do you think, Alex? Should we focus on this as the first step of our work?
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions. No government support, what to do? The question of the first step, and then is it too early? And let's go in inverse order, and you can just choose any of the 3 questions you want to speak to, and then hopefully we'll be able to go through quite a few of them. Tiffany.
Yeah, so just on the point about no government support, I think that's actually quite relevant to the UK context, where for a very long time, active travel wasn't seen as a strategic priority, wasn't treated as one. And Active Travel England was only recently set up to provide guidance and set standards for what active travel infrastructure should look like across the UK. And the significant funding cuts to Active Travel England recently just undermine the commitment from the government to active travel and decarbonising transport. But I think the bigger issue around the lack of government support is that inevitably leads to inequalities in cycling, because what will happen is you'll have volunteers or activists who tend to be more privileged people with the time and resources to campaign for active travel infrastructure, for better cycling policies, for investment in active travel. And this privileged cohort is often very well-intentioned, but not diverse, and they can just miss out a lot of needs of wider types of people who would benefit from active travel investment and infrastructure.
Thank you. Camilla, which question would you like to take?
Well, I like the one about good practices. I think, well, we've been saying that there is a knowledge gap with regards to this topic. So I would say that the first thing is to understand what is really preventing caregivers and women from cycling. I think I recently was trying to do this research to understand what are these barriers, and I realized that there is really no research about this. So there is really no academic research about what are the barriers preventing women from cycling, what are the barriers preventing caregivers, right? We know that the sexual harassment, gender violence is a barrier, right? We know that road safety is a barrier, but there is really no structure about all of these barriers. So I would say a good practice would be to first understand what is it that is happening.
Thank you. And Alex, we had the question by the cyclist mayor or the cycling mayor, if you could explain to the audience what this actually is, and then get back to this crucial point.
Yes.
We discussed it before, too early, what's the sequencing, where to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned in the presentation this global network of bicycle mayors that are part of bikes. These are volunteers who within their city are working to sort of both unify efforts on the ground, but also connect efforts from their city to efforts in other cities and bring learnings back. So yeah, Mohammed, I'm so glad you joined us this evening. He's done some great work translating some of our knowledge products. We generally publish them in English and are now starting to translate them into Spanish, but he has been able to translate it for us into other languages in order to grow the readership. So thank you. And thank you for your question. I think in terms of whether something is too early, and sort of, I think it goes back to your question, are we sort of pushing it too fast, too much, all at once? But I think, and maybe this even ties into sort of what the question about, like, what is the first step? But it's really about thinking about within society, within your local context, what are the existing sort of structures and communities related to care, and where can we sort of strategically start to think about how cycling can benefit those communities? So rather than thinking about all the naysayers and the groups that might have trouble with this concept, let's think about all those that could really benefit, and start with them and help them understand, whether it's through workshops or classes or campaigns, all the potential benefits that they could have through cycling.
Thank you. So let's do a round in the room. We will need the microphone. So who would like to come in? And colleagues online, continue submitting your questions. I think we can do at least another 2 or 3 rounds even. So let's start at the very back, the gentleman with the black tie. Sorry, we'll make our way to the front.
Very good evening, panel. I am from Jabalpur, India. In India, there are so many cycle pathways has already been created, expecting that the cyclers will increase over the time. In last 5 to 6 years, as an administrator, I could see that the number is not at all increasing. What we have understood is that cycling is considered to be the alternative to traffic. Here also, I could see in London, the similar thing is happening, that people are taking cycling as a leisure or for exercise or at the most to avoid traffics. Now, where we are talking about the cycling to the caregivers, there is a big issue for the cycling is that I may say there are issues with the cycling is that it is not a weatherproof. Like if there is a rainfall, we will not go for cycles. Secondly, cycle as a bicycle is a misnomer. What I mean to say is that why cycle should be two-wheeler only. Now, we can create a certain structure of cycling where it could be rain-proof, it could be sunlight-proof for three-wheeler cycles, which could be better alternative for caregivers, where a mother, the first picture which that slide has shown is a three-wheeler cycle, where there were children and the mother was cycling. That kind of cycle where we could keep carry our children, as well as it could be the weatherproof. Why government across other different countries are not promoting that kind of cycle where it could be helpful as a family, as well as it could be weatherproof?
Thank you very much. This gets us also into the technicalities of what type of vehicle still qualifies as a bike. And if we're talking about moving other people with us and goods, that's a very important question. We have a second question, the gentleman in the shirt here in the second row. Yes.
Yeah, my question, it's a little bit about the economic constraints that some households might be facing, because it depends on the conditions of each city. But for example, I can imagine that certain cities would need electrical bikes plus all the gear. And for many households, I can imagine that this becomes a constraint, an important constraint to actually embrace this new mobility of care, and especially given the tools that you were mentioning, that it's not just a cycle. You also need bags, you need like lights, a lot of gear and things. So to what extent, in your experience, from a policy perspective, do the governments are dealing with this as well? So for example, providing subsidies, free bikes or something like that, because we can see that they do these kind of things for electric cars. So I think that it would be very interesting also to try to analyze to what extent they could do something similar with bikes.
Thank you very much. I do want to come back to the lady over here. So want to make sure, yes, please. Third question.
Okay, thank you very much for this event. Very glad to hear that now care is like part of the discussion of urbanism and urban planning. And I think that recognition of care work is really important, but I also wanted to know like how transport planning and maybe this kind of project can help to redistribute this kind of care work.
Great. Again, another round of 3 wonderful questions. And Alex, let's start with you. Pick and choose.
Yes. Yeah, I thought the second question was very interesting, and just a particular example from the pilot projects we did in Istanbul. The local group wanted to provide the caregivers and the children with bicycles as sort of a reward for having completed the program. They said, well, if you stick with this, if you learn the skills, if you apply them, if you really start using them as part of your care journeys, we want to make sure that you have a bicycle to use at the end of this program. The tariffs on bicycles, to import bicycles into a country like Turkey, make a bicycle, as compared to purchasing one here in Europe or the UK or in North America, something like 5 or 8 times as expensive on a relative sense. I was not aware of this. I believe this is true in many countries. I know Ethiopia is another example, just off the top of my head, from some work we've done, where they really want to provide these bicycles. There's such a limited supply in these countries, and because it's still regarded as a luxury, the country puts huge import tariffs on them. So that's something we often don't think about when we think about the barriers to cycling, is just the limited options that are available. There have been certain things done where secondhand bicycles from countries like the Netherlands are transported to these countries to try to increase the supply, but really it's really a supply chain issue, that there needs to be bicycles manufactured in these countries, and these tariffs need to be taken away. So that's sort of one little anecdote about the economics and the limits that it puts on cycling.
Camilla. There was an obvious question for you. Come on.
An obvious, the redistribution of.
Well, how to deal with the care agenda? How is it mainstreamed into transport planning? What does it actually mean?
Yeah, well, what I understood from the question is how can this actually help to redistribute the care. I don't really know how to answer the question, but I have some ideas, and is that we actually do know how women and men move, right? So we do know that women walk more and use more public transport, and then men use more the bicycle and use the car more. So I think, again, when we think about the care city, we are thinking that men are gonna walk more and that they are probably gonna use more public transport, right? And therefore, this could impact the redistribution of tasks. I also think that mobility is ingrained in every part of our life. So if we are able to make women cycle more, this could definitely impact how we see the bicycle and how we see the modes of transport just in general. But yeah, those are only thoughts. It's a very, very good question. I would also want to know what the answer is. but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tiffany, this question about how inclusive should we be about the terminology of what cycling is all about and the vehicles we use for cycling is quite an important one, because you can imagine, particularly if you have battery-powered electric bikes, you know, you have SUV bikes soon, right? Huge and comfortable and all of that, but we are losing the spatial efficiency. Where do you draw the boundary, and what's your broader attitude to the questions which we heard from the gentleman from India about, you know, issues of weather and that it is in the end more seen as a leisure instrument in some cultures? Over to you.
Yeah, so I think just in defining cycles or mobility aids, this is especially topical in the cargo bike logistics sector at the moment, because we've seen increasingly variable types of cargo bikes, which look like the more traditional early models of front-loading cargo bikes, or ones that are trikes with big trailers or boxes attached to the back, and increasingly some Amazon ones, which I think are officially classed as micro-mobility vehicles, which look like mini smart cars. So the question around what counts or what's classified as a cycle is increasingly blurred. And I think we'll continue to see more innovation in that area. So I don't have an answer for that. But in terms of weather, that's quite relevant to a Sustrans project that we're doing in Wales in partnership with the Welsh government, which is eMove. It's an e-bike and e-cargo bike loan scheme. And it's also the Welsh government, or one of the Welsh government's gender budgeting pilots. It's a very exciting opportunity to use active travel as an inroad to promote more inclusive and equitable economic development strategies. And weather is a barrier for cycling in Wales. And one of the lessons for the eMove program going forward is that it's not enough to loan out the e-bikes or e-cargo bikes. It's also important to loan weatherproof equipment, or at least make that free and more widely available, so that people who take up the loan also have access to things they need to use the e-bikes and e-cargo bikes throughout the winter and just in bad rainy weather.
Thank you. I'm looking again at my colleagues regarding online participants' input, and then we come back to another round in the room. So 3 questions from our Zoom participants.
We have plenty more questions here. So we have a question from Jose Aravello, who is from the SUR Institute in Mexico. And he wants to know, this question for you, Alex, are you planning to partner with local NGOs around the world to monitor and evaluate the transformation that might happen in small to medium-sized cities that can eventually apply the toolkit during their public policy decisions towards mobility of care?
Thank you. Next.
Another question from Olamide, who is from the Lagos Urban Development Initiative. And she wants to know, should it be policy before grassroots activities or vice versa, or do both need to happen at the same time? The final question for this round is from Manish Thakur, who's a student here at the Executive Masters in Cities. And they say, thank you for the insightful presentation. And they are going back to your presentation where on the slide where you showed barriers and benefits. They say you mentioned traffic safety and insufficient infrastructure. What are your recommendations on these critical aspects to policymakers, planners, and urban local bodies that shape the decision of girls and women or caregivers to take up cycling?
Thank you very much. So questions from Jose, Polly, and Manish. Alex, let's start with you.
Well, yes, thank you for the questions. Maybe I'll start with Jose, since I believe it was directed to me. I think the question was around partnering with NGOs in smaller and medium-sized cities to implement the toolkit. As I said, bikes is a a global network, and we are nothing without our partners. We are a staff of 12 people, and the only way we could do the work we do and have the impact we have is through our global network of partner organizations. So Jose, I can't tell if you're referring to your own organization, but if you are, let's talk, definitely, because we would love to work with you. And the comment about the small and medium-sized cities, I think, is also an important one, because I think, you know, the cities we mentioned are all mega cities, and the ones that often get talked about. And I know I've heard it directly from cities in countries where there is sort of a shining light city, and then every other city gets basically zero attention. And those absolutely are the important cities. And you could argue in some senses where there's maybe even more potential for the bicycle, maybe potentially smaller distances, closer knit communities. And absolutely, small and medium-sized cities are definitely a priority, I think, in addition to the mega cities. So, yes.
Thank you. Tiffany.
On the question about whether policy or grassroots activism has to come first, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And ideally, you would have people at policymaking, which is informed by grassroots activism and matched by visionary leaders who take those desires on board. The other thing about that is all of the literature on what we need to achieve a just transition to net zero underscores the importance of trust, because trust is the essential currency that we need for a just transition, whether it's just transition to low carbon mobility systems or a net zero economy or net zero cities. And to do that, you really do need that synergy between policymakers and grassroots activism.
Thank you, Camilla.
I think there was another question about traffic safety and insufficient infrastructure. I think, well, there are a lot of materials and documents that tell us how we should design our streets. So I won't go into those details, but what I really think is that we need to start with the local government. So how do we actually interact with the people that work in local governments so that these people understand what it is to cycle in the streets that there are. Very recently in bikes, we were talking with the local government in Santiago de Chile, and they were telling us about all of the great work that they are doing in their city, because they started just by sensibilization campaigns with the people that work in the local governments. They were working with mothers that work in the municipality. They were working with men that were also fathers that were working there. And so they started the process within the institutions to make them understand how this actually is lived by the people in the streets. But this, of course, comes from a very broad agenda that the federal government, that the national government has, which is a very feminist agenda, right? So I would say that it's really, really relevant that the governments actually embrace this agenda of, well, feminist agenda. If it's too political, we can also name it in different ways, right? Even though it's not the best, right? But this happens, and I think it's really important that governments really just look at it from their own perspective. That really works.
Thank you very much. We have time for 3 very quick, concise questions. Who has a really eager final question? I have a person right here, the lady in the corner, and the gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody. You mentioned for the barriers, that's personal safety and traffic safety. And this is a very big issue. When I saw the slides there, the first slide, the girls cycling with 3 kids in the front box. And we know the kids are very active, right? And if we make a risk analysis, the opportunity to the accident to happen is, I think, high, and the casualty or the severity is very high. So why to take this risk and use this for the kids?
Thank you. And remind us which city you're coming from?
I'm from urban city. One more question.
No,
This is not applicable.
We don't have the time. Sorry, we need to go to Dublin.
I'd offer to speak very quickly, but that would upset the translators. My name is Kat, I'm from Dublin. I'd like to ask about hostile or protective infrastructure, whichever perspective you're coming from, to avoid criminality. We have gates at a lot of our parks that are kissing gates to stop motorcycles and things entering the parks. We don't find that hostile infrastructure on commuter cycling routes, but it is on our neighbouring cycling routes. So I'd like to know from the panel, have you found this? Have you found ways of overcoming it? We got some removed. The police asked to put them back in, and they were successful.
Very much. And our final question.
Hi, I'm Farah. I work in the Van Leer Foundation in Jordan, and my question was, it's based on the assumption that your programs were running pre-COVID. So I just wanted to see if during COVID you have, intensified your programming in the sense that there was more uptake in using bikes, at least in my part of the world, where the uptake was more than 200% in terms of sales. So I was wondering if your program did address or take advantage of that period.
Thank you. Tiffany, let's begin with you and then go this way around.
Yes, just on your question about hostile infrastructure. So Sustrans are the custodian of the National Cycle Network, which are mostly traffic-free walking, wheeling and cycling routes throughout the UK. And one of the biggest problems is that not all of those routes are actually accessible because of hostile infrastructure, kissing gates and other types of barriers. And we've had to reclassify sections of the National Cycle Network as not really the National Cycle Network because the barriers are just, it just makes it not feasible. So we've been doing barrier audits across the country just to identify where we need to remove barriers. And some of the biggest problems are just around land ownership and having to negotiate with whoever owns the land that the barriers are on, who don't actually really want people walking, wheeling, recycling there, or for other reasons, just don't want to engage.
Thank you. Camilla?
Yeah, about the personal safety and the road safety question, I think it really goes back to the question that it's been out there forever. And it's if the bike is dangerous in itself. It's cycling is a dangerous practice. If we should be cycling in the streets. And I think it also has to do with the question about the helmet, whether we should be using a helmet or not, and why cities are forcing people to use helmets, right? And now bicycle, but with kids, right? So it's like kind of the same question, but it's the same question from before. And I think that the main thing is that we need to stop thinking that cycling is a dangerous practice, because it is not dangerous practice. What is dangerous is the cities that we've been building where cars go so fast, right? So I don't know how to answer directly the question about the children on bikes, but I think we should really go back and reflect, why are we still thinking that cycling is a dangerous practice, and not thinking that what is dangerous is that the cars go so fast in our cities and that children cannot play in the streets anymore, etc., etc. So I think it's a more broad question, really.
Thank you. Alex.
Just a two-part answer to the question here about COVID and the impact on programs. I think on the one hand, yeah, it really, for so many people, it was maybe an unintentional way of awakening or reawakening something that maybe they had done as children and maybe had never done as adults, but it gave us sort of this bizarre experiment to see in cities what it would be like if we took away all the cars and gave people the freedom to, in many cases, yeah, try this, either for the first time in many years or for the first time ever. So I think in some ways, yes, it created this really shocking demand in many cities for cycling because it gave us this experiment. On the downside, though, I think what it showed is the weakness of the cycling industry, actually, that cycle companies unfortunately still, and the way I'll phrase this is they're not thinking like car companies. I think too many cycle companies have sort of their small niche market, and when something like COVID happens and everyone wants a bike and there are no bikes available, I think it's because for too long cycle companies have been operating in that way. And I would challenge cycle companies to think of like what we are saying, think of the opportunities to create a larger market by getting more people like caregivers and young children cycling, and think about what that could do. If you really take this opportunity to increase cycling in cities and the potential there, even on sort of the industry side.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we'll have to bring this to a close. I would like to start by very much congratulating Alex and Camilla for their groundbreaking work. I mean, you are introducing not just new terminology, but a new and novel and fresh agenda to the world of transport, the world of feminism, of gender, of cycling, of green cities, of more equitable cities, and that this term around mobility of care has traction. The last 90 minutes has absolutely shown and indicated. I do think we have very interesting questions about the sequencing. Where do we start? But I'm also more convinced than maybe before that if you have a city with a certain level of infrastructure already available, where it's not completely sort of suicidal to be out there in the road, to jump immediately to sort of cycling for care can be a very powerful instrument for the culture change we need. And that is, I think, what a lot of more conventional strategies around cycling, they're still a bit shy about, that this is about cultural transformation. And if you see a mother, or ideally also a father, with a kid on a bike, it does communicate something which goes deeper than what we call in London lycra lads, which are typically men in their 30s, 40s, maybe 50s, with a full gear and helmet and very sweaty. Now, I also would like to thank the colleagues that have made this evening possible, Emily Cruz, Katie Beck, and Marie Kahn. Without that kind of support making these events happening in the backdrop, none of it would be possible, and that's absolutely central. Many thanks for that. I want to thank our panelists again, and also Tiffany. I haven't mentioned you yet by name in the final round, but bringing sort of the outsider's perspective to this innovative work was really helpful and important. And I'm curious to see how much you will embed maybe this wonderful document in your own work. The final thanks needs to go to the Bernard van Leer Foundation and Rushda Majid. Without you guys, this would be impossible. We are convening an incredible network of change makers. They come with a perspective of the young, the very young, and the caregivers, but it allows us to venture deep into questions of how we design our streets, and increasing also how we design public spaces, maybe our homes, how we deal with migration. This has proved to be an incredibly powerful lens. So much to build on. Thank you very much for the support to date. And many thanks to all of you in the room as well as online. Very active audience, great questions, and I wish you a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.